Imagine the first human who chose to wear an animal's skin, not because anyone told them to, not because it looked impressive, and perhaps not even because they were cold. That single decision seems so ordinary that most of us never question it. Yet it may have been one of the most important turning points in the entire story of our species. For generations, we've accepted a simple explanation. Ancient humans wore clothes to survive harsh weather. It sounds obvious, but the deeper researchers dug into our past, the stranger the evidence became. The timeline didn't match, the clues pointed in different directions, and every new discovery seemed to replace one mystery with an even bigger one. Picture a small group of ancient humans gathered around a flickering campfire as darkness closes in around them. One person quietly drapes a rough animal hide over their shoulders. It isn't stitched neatly, it barely stays in place. Yet that crude piece of skin may have changed the future of humanity more than the sharpened spear lying beside the fire. Why? Because from that moment on, humans were no longer relying only on the bodies nature had given them. They had begun experimenting with something entirely different. But what were they really trying to achieve? Protection, comfort, survival? Or was something much bigger already beginning? To answer that, we have to start with the explanation almost everyone believes. At first glance, it seems completely convincing. In fact, for decades, scientists believed they had already solved the mystery. But as you'll soon see, that answer was only the beginning of a much deeper story. If you asked almost anyone why humans started wearing clothes, you'd probably hear the same answer: to stay warm. And on the surface, that explanation seems impossible to argue with. Unlike mammoths wrapped in thick fur or Arctic foxes built for freezing temperatures, humans are surprisingly vulnerable to the cold. Strip away modern clothing, and even a mild winter night can become life-threatening. The evidence appears to support that idea. Around 70,000 years ago, groups of modern humans began expanding into colder parts of Europe and Asia, regions where icy winds and long winters pushed survival to its limits. Animal hides would have acted like portable shelters, trapping body heat and protecting exposed skin from frostbite. A successful hunt no longer provided just meat, it also offered a resource that could be transformed into protection against an unforgiving climate. Picture an early hunter skinning a reindeer beside a crackling fire. Every scrape of a stone tool removed fat and tissue, making the hide softer and less likely to rot. It was slow, exhausting work, but the reward was enormous. A well-prepared skin could mean the difference between surviving another winter or becoming another frozen body lost to the landscape. For a long time, researchers believed this solved the mystery, but then the clues stopped fitting together. Evidence began appearing that suggested humans had started covering their bodies before reaching many of those icy environments. Even more puzzling, some populations living in cold regions seem to rely on simple wraps rather than the carefully crafted garments scientists expected. If clothing existed before the harshest winters demanded it, then warmth couldn't have been the whole reason. Instead of ending the story, the cold had opened the door to an even deeper mystery. The common belief is simple: colder weather forced humans to invent clothing. It sounds logical. But when researchers began comparing ancient migration routes with evidence from archaeology and genetics, something didn't add up. The timeline refused to cooperate. One of the biggest clues came from an unexpected source: not bones, not cave paintings, but tiny parasites. Human lice exist in two distinct forms: head lice and clothing lice. While head lice spend their entire lives in hair, clothing lice can only survive in garments, laying their eggs in fabric or animal hides instead of on the body. That means they couldn't have existed before humans regularly wore clothing. Researchers compared the DNA of these two parasites, expecting the split to match humanity's arrival in the coldest regions of Eurasia. It didn't. The genetic evidence pointed to clothing becoming common much earlier, really between 170,000 and 200,000 years ago, when modern humans were still living primarily in Africa. That was a surprising result. Large parts of Africa certainly experience cool nights, but they aren't the frozen landscapes most people imagine when thinking about the invention of clothes. Suddenly, the old explanation began to crack. If our ancestors were already wearing body coverings before they faced the harshest ice age conditions, then cold weather couldn't have been the original trigger. It may have made clothing more important, but perhaps it wasn't the reason clothing appeared in the first place. So what changed around that time? What happened that convinced humans to spend countless hours preparing hides, weaving plant fibers, or wrapping themselves in materials no other primate seemed interested in wearing? The clues were pointing somewhere unexpected. And the next discovery wouldn't come from ancient humans at all, it would come from what they had already lost. The mystery had reached a dead end. Archaeologists rarely find ancient clothing because leather, fur, and plant fibers decay long before they can fossilize. So, how could anyone discover what people were wearing nearly 200,000 years ago if the clothes themselves had vanished? Instead of searching for garments, researchers looked for the tools used to make them. Across caves in Africa and the Middle East, teams uncovered carefully shaped stone scrapers, unlike ordinary cutting tools. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable, but microscopic analysis revealed something fascinating. The worn edges carried tiny polishing marks and residue consistent with scraping animal hides over and over again. These weren't tools designed primarily for butchering meat. They had been repeatedly used to clean, soften, and prepare skins. That finding raised an even bigger question. Why invest so much time processing hides if people only needed an occasional blanket against the cold? Then another clue appeared at several archaeological sites. Researchers noticed that hide working tools became increasingly specialized over thousands of years. Different shapes were crafted for different stages of the process, suggesting that preparing skins had evolved into a skilled craft rather than a simple survival task. People weren't just throwing animal hides over their shoulders anymore. They were refining techniques, improving materials, and passing knowledge from one generation to the next. The implication was profound. Clothing wasn't emerging as a desperate response to freezing weather. It was becoming part of a much larger technological revolution, one that required planning, cooperation, and the ability to imagine benefits far into the future. But if clothing had become a technology instead of merely protection, one question suddenly became impossible to ignore. What problem were our ancestors really trying to solve? In the late 20th century, archaeologist Olga Soffer wasn't searching for the origin of fashion. She was trying to answer a far older question. How did Ice Age people survive in environments that should have been nearly impossible for humans to inhabit? The clues were scattered across ancient campsites in Eastern Europe. Hunters had left behind mammoth bones, stone blades, and thousands of tiny ivory needles, some no bigger than a modern sewing needle. At first, they seemed like ordinary tools. But the closer Soffer and her colleagues looked, the stranger they became. These needles had carefully drilled eyes. Think about what that means. A sharpened bone can punch holes through leather, but an eyed needle allows thread to pass through, creating fitted seams instead of loose wraps. Whoever made these tools wasn't simply covering their body with animal skins. They were shaping garments to fit people as they moved, hunted, and survived. Imagine one evening inside an Ice Age shelter. A child sits beside the fire while an elder patiently pulls sinew through soft reindeer hide. Outside, freezing winds sweep across the open plains. Inside, every stitch carries knowledge accumulated over countless generations. If the garment fails, someone may not survive the journey ahead. If it succeeds, that knowledge will be passed to the next pair of hands. For Soffer, those tiny needles told a story far bigger than clothing. They revealed planning, teaching, craftsmanship, and something deeply human, the willingness to spend hours preparing for dangers that hadn't arrived yet. But those remarkable needles also created another mystery. If humans devoted so much effort to making clothes, perhaps survival wasn't the only thing they were stitching together. By now, the mystery had outgrown clothing itself. The more researchers compared ancient cultures, the clearer one pattern became. Humans weren't the only creatures that modified their environment to survive. Beavers built dams, birds wove intricate nests, hermit crabs borrowed empty shells. Across the animal kingdom, life had evolved countless ways to solve problems without changing the body itself. But humans did something fundamentally different. Instead of adapting only the world around them, they began adapting themselves. Think about it. A fur coat grows naturally on a wolf. A thick layer of blubber protects a seal. Those animals must wait for evolution to reshape their bodies over thousands of generations. Humans found another path. By wrapping themselves in hides, weaving plant fibers, and eventually spinning wool and linen, they could change their protection in a single lifetime. No genetic mutation required, and once that idea appeared, it spread everywhere. From the frozen Arctic to the burning deserts of Australia, from the mountain villages of the Andes to the forests of Central Africa, every civilization developed clothing that reflected its own environment. Some garments trapped precious heat, others blocked the sun, deflected insects, or shielded skin from thorn-covered landscapes. Different cultures reached different solutions, yet they all followed the same remarkable principle. When the body wasn't enough, the mind became the tool of adaptation. That realization changed the way many anthropologists viewed human evolution. Clothing wasn't simply another invention. It was evidence that humans had begun outsourcing survival to technology. Every new material, every improved stitch, Every better design made the human body capable of living where nature had never intended. But if clothing transformed the limits of the human body, an even more intriguing question remained. At what point did people stop wearing clothes merely to survive and start wearing them to say something about who they were? Of course, every good theory has exceptions, and the story of clothing is no different. Even today, there are indigenous communities living in tropical regions who traditionally wear very little clothing despite having the knowledge and materials to make more. Early European explorers often misunderstood this, assuming these societies were somehow behind. They weren't. In hot, humid climates, heavy garments can trap heat, increase dehydration, and even make survival harder. Sometimes the smartest adaptation is wearing less, not more. The archaeological record tells a similar story. Neanderthals survived hundreds of thousands of years in Ice Age Europe, yet many researchers believe they relied mostly on loosely draped animal hides instead of tightly stitched clothing. That worked well enough for a time. But when modern humans arrived carrying eyed needles and more carefully fitted garments, they could venture farther, remain active longer, and endure harsher conditions with greater efficiency. It wasn't simply about being warmer, it was about wasting less energy. There are exceptions in the opposite direction as well. Some ancient societies living in relatively mild climates invested enormous effort into clothing that offered little practical protection. Elaborate feather cloaks, decorated furs, dyed fabrics, and woven ornaments required hundreds of hours to create. Their value clearly extended beyond survival. These unusual cases reveal something important. Clothing has never followed a single universal rule. Climate mattered, but it wasn't the only force shaping what people wore. That raises one final question. If clothes weren't always about warmth, and sometimes weren't even about protection, what invisible purpose made them one of humanity's most enduring inventions? The real reason ancient humans started wearing clothes wasn't simply to survive the cold. Cold may have accelerated the process, but it wasn't the spark. The spark was something far more powerful. It was the moment humans realized they no longer had to accept the limits of their own bodies. Think about every clue we've uncovered. The genetic trail left by clothing lice, the stone scrapers polished by thousands of hides, the carefully crafted bone needles, the extraordinary diversity of garments across continents. At first, they seemed like separate pieces of evidence, but together, they reveal a single pattern. Clothing was humanity's first wearable technology. Long before metal tools, written language, or cities, people had already discovered a revolutionary idea. If evolution couldn't change the body quickly enough, the mind could. Imagine how radical that was. Every other animal survives mainly with the body it is born with. A wolf cannot decide to grow thinner fur in summer or thicker fur overnight in winter. A deer cannot invent protection against thorns or insects. Its body changes only through countless generations of evolution. Humans found a shortcut. Instead of waiting for nature, they redesigned the relationship between themselves and the environment. Animal hides became a second skin. Woven fibers became portable shelter. Every improvement allowed people to cross mountains, survive deserts, endure ice, and explore places no naked primate could have reached. But the transformation didn't stop there. Once humans learned they could change themselves with objects, clothing became more than protection. It became identity. A hunter could be recognized by what he wore. A healer could signal authority without speaking. Families, tribes, and eventually entire civilizations began expressing status, belief, occupation, and belonging through garments. Clothing evolved from survival into communication, and that may be the most astonishing part of the story. The first hide thrown across someone's shoulders wasn't just keeping a body alive. It marked the beginning of a new kind of evolution, one driven not by genes but by ideas. From that moment forward, humanity would solve its greatest challenges not by growing new bodies, but by inventing new tools. Clothes were simply the first reminder that the human mind could become its own greatest adaptation. Now, return to that windswept plain where a small group of humans disappeared into the glow of a distant fire. One figure still carried that rough animal hide across their shoulders. To anyone watching at the time, it would have looked like an ordinary piece of skin taken from a successful hunt. Nothing more, but history was quietly changing. That hide represented the moment humans stopped relying solely on the bodies nature had given them and began relying on the imagination they carried inside them. Every coat, every uniform, every spacesuit, and every protective suit worn today traces its story back to that simple decision to create a second skin. Perhaps that's what has always separated us from every other species. We don't just adapt to the world, we redesign our place within it. Civilization didn't begin with stone walls or written words. In many ways, it began the moment an ancient human looked at an animal's skin and saw not what it had been, but what it could become.